And now I understand. And you talk to me about life, about real life, about human misery, Benny went on. He was not speaking loudly nor fast. Still, the cold but vehement and level tone of his voice drew several people to turn around and listen and watch. The other sat his ground with a patient sneer. I offered you work, and you were too good for it. We buy stuff from guys like you all the time, writing under pen names to protect names that are never going to be published anywhere else. But they keep thinking they'll make it, what they want to do but never quite manage, and they keep on doing what they're too good for. It's a joke, Benny repeated. And it was now that his voice began to rise. I know you. You're the only serious person in the room, aren't you? The only one who understands. And you can prove it by the fact that you've never finished a single thing in your life. You're the only well-educated person because you never went to college. And you resent education. You resent social ease. You resent good manners. You resent success. You resent any kind of success. You resent God. You resent Christ. You resent $1,000 bills. You resent Christmas. By God, you resent happiness. You resent happiness itself because none of that's real. What is real, then? Nothing's real to you that isn't part of your own past. Real life, a swamp of failures, of social, sexual, financial, personal, spiritual failure. Real life. You poor bastard. You don't know what real life is. You've never been near it. All you have is 1,000 intellectualized ideas about life. But life? Have you ever measured yourself against anything but your own lousy past? Have you ever faced anything outside yourself? Life? You poor bastard. Benny started to laugh. A section there from William Gaddis's 1955 novel, The Recognitions. I've been dreading this review. And no, I didn't manage to read The Recognitions, this 933-page in the New York Review of Books edition and 956-page originally. I did not manage to read this over 900-page novel between my last review and now. This has been my long read. I tend to keep a long read, something over 600 pages, going behind the scenes, and this has been mine now for probably about a month. It's taken me quite a while. It's a very demanding novel, but I'll get to that. But I've been dreading this review. There's too much for me to undertake in such a review. I don't really know where to start, and so I've planned simply to start with the basics, an outline. What is this book? So, The Recognitions is written by William Gaddis. It was published in 1955. It was his debut novel. Gaddis was 33 when it was published, but he was working on it for many years. The plot loosely follows the life of Wyatt Gwyon, Gwyon, Wyatt, who was the son of a Calvinist minister from rural New England. He plans originally to follow his father into the ministry to become a practicing Calvinist minister himself, but Wyatt is inspired to become a painter, and he has an aptitude and talent for painting, which is sort of denounced by his mother, and the general Calvinist temperament, pure Calvinist temperament, against that form of creativity. Anyway, Wyatt does pursue painting, and he travels to Europe to study it, and he's discouraged by the corruption, the cynicism, the attitude, and the atmosphere of the arts there. He then moves to New York City, which is where we're introduced to the majority of the other characters in the novel. And even though it's a very encyclopedic novel, the cast of characters who are recurring is very tight. He meets a man called Rectal Brown, who is a capitalist sort of collector and dealer of art, and this Brown makes him a Faustian bargain, that Wyatt is to produce paintings in the style of 15th century masters, forge their signatures so that Rectal Brown can sell them as newly discovered originals, a complete pretense. Wyatt once again becomes discouraged and returns home to find his father has converted to Mithraism and preaching new ideas to his congregation, is worshipping the sun, and has steadily been losing his mind. Back in New York, Wyatt tries to expose all the forgeries, expose the corruption that he's been within, but eventually finds himself traveling to Spain to visit a monastery in a more clear-cut search for authenticity at this juncture in his life. Interwoven into this are Otto, a struggling writer, Esme, a muse and sometimes discussed as a succubus, Stanley, a musician, and a few others. The novel ends with a bang, and it mostly takes place in the 1940s and the 1950s. But what am I to do with a 933-page, highly intricate, highly detailed, highly complex, highly structured novel, which is ultimately still not truly discovered? I was cautious when I reviewed Moby Dick, but the great wealth of readings and scholarship on it allowed me to penetrate it actually with a relative ease. The Recognitions has still, ironically, yet to really be recognized. It holds a very peculiar place in the history of style, of genre, and of culture. Firstly, the style. Upon its release, some early critics or early reviewers, though there is an entire book about the debut of the novel and how the majority of the early reviews didn't really read the novel altogether, or basically just glossed it and then quickly wrote a review. And this is in a book called Fire the Bastards by Jack Green, this is a book which is really a reprinting of a newspaper called Newspaper by Jack Green, within which some issues and columns were dedicated to the appreciation of the Recognitions when it was launched. However, back to my main point, where do we really situate this book? Some people originally said, well, it's sort of Joycean, it's following in that modernist tradition. The problem being that Gaddis openly made it clear that he tried to read Joyce. He'd read a bit of Ulysses, but didn't really find it all that enthralling and just doesn't see himself there at all. And it's clear now that he's not. But at the same time, we might think, well, 1955, it's a little bit early for the full postmodernist rush with Pynchon, etc. Pynchon, Barthelme. And so it's not fully postmodernist with that Pynchonian, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but that Pynchonian zaniness, which is reliant on a consumer culture, we could say, that hadn't fully flourished by 55. And so how would I describe Gaddis if we'd say what genre? I would say he's after modernism, but he's a proto-postmodernist rolled into one. And the reason I would say he is after modernism, but still isn't in this possibly tenuous umbilical relationship with modernism in the sense of beholding to an ideal, is that, well, it's there, but he is attending to it in full admittance of its current post-war turbulence. What do we do with these great narratives that are falling away? It's one of the clearest first acceptances of the falling away, but it's almost like the death of God, but God is dying. Something akin to that. But with regard to the proto-postmodernism, we see a pioneering of black humour, of cynicism, of Menippean satire, of a seriousness regarding what is, for many people, a gratuitousness of discourse, a needlessness of dialogue, of a specificity which is often extremely dense, the encyclopedic nature of the novel, which, this is perhaps one of the earliest examples of this encyclopedic attitude which the certain and many postmodernists then go on to really own, this maximalist style that we see once again in Pynchon, DeLillo, Foster Wallace. This is an early progenitor of all these postmodernist traits, but it isn't really taking them for a ride for its own sake. There is an extreme seriousness to this novel, an extreme demand on the reader. And in fact, I don't think I've ever read a fiction book which has been as demanding on me in terms of my attention, in terms of my understanding, in terms of my need to cross-reference and look things up and really think about what's going on, more so than Gaddis's The Recognitions. It's undoubtedly a masterpiece. It's very swiftly, after about 200 pages, entered into my very short list of books I consider to be basically perfect. 10 out of 10s. It's emphatically seated in there without any sense of doubt. But what's it about, really? We have this plot of Wyatt going from something seemingly sincere, familial, a lineage, a family, a tradition. This remove from a tradition which is already crumbling under the weight of the father's own steadily loosening mind. The move away from this patriarchal or paternal centeredness, the absence of the father figure who is already lost to himself, which is a very key theme throughout Gaddis's work. I've come to find, as have immediately begun other Gaddis work and Gaddis secondary literature, because I'm now fascinated by him as a writer. The move for Wyatt from this, but still in that modernist sense, accepting the search for truth, for emphatically authenticity, for genuineness, for the real. That entire edifice hasn't crumbled completely yet, and so there may very well be this move away from the familial, from the traditional, from the traditionally spiritual, in this sense of the family's Calvinist upbringing, which all the while the theological language of the novel is a socio-cultural battle between Calvinist and Catholic temperaments regarding salvation. This is sort of one of the many grammars which is carrying the novel along. But he's moving from this into a form of authenticity with respect to creation, with respect to an individual subjectivity, but almost immediately he is finding himself thwarted by the corruption, the fakeness, the mask-like nature of the painting career that he's entering into. And to give an example of many of the scenes or types of scenes that one would be reading about when they approach this novel, there is a scene where a painting is revealed 3 times by the act of washing one painting away. A bad fake is washed away or scratched away on the painting to reveal a good fake, which is scratched away to reveal the real painting. That in itself would be the simplest scene as a metaphor for the novel itself. This multi-layering, but each sort of archaeological dig beneath each thing only intensifies the question of authenticity, because once you get through to that original painting and you say, oh, we've gone past 2 fake ones of this same painting and now we're through to the real one, well, if the appreciation of those quote-unquote false original fakes which were being appreciated and recognized prior were recognized as such, then one, what does this say about authenticity? 2, what does this say about our own status, power, fame, and collective mimesis in relation to authenticity? And 3, it also brings into question our complete sort of worship of authenticity in general, our search for something which we consider to be real, to be genuine, to be worthwhile in terms of values. The same applies when we're talking theologically in the novel. There is moments where it's emphasized that Christian churches were built on top of old pagan churches, that there is a bleeding through in one other author that we would see this with, who applies this in certainly a different sense, less a sociological sense, but with someone such as Cormac McCarthy, who, for him, the mythic realm, this unspoken, possibly unconscious, archetypal mythic realm, is forever always there, and it bleeds through in moments, but it bleeds through in moments which themselves nothing can be put in the way of. We don't get to possess them, we don't get to have them, we don't get to create them, we don't get to own them, we don't get to control them. And it's in this sense that the characters, many of the characters in this novel, in their oh so human march towards the authentic, are constantly thwarted because they are bringing themselves with them. And that in its sense mirrors one of the perhaps discussions between the Calvinist and the Catholic theology underlying the novel, in the sense of what is it to approach God in terms of grace, and what does it mean to put something in between oneself and God? And is that always a case of our own putting something in front of God and getting in the way? The real is there, but it's in our approach that we lose ourselves, because in our approach we want something from it. We want to abuse it, we want to use it, we want to subsume it into our culture for our own gain. And the real is the real, the authentic, the, you know, if there is a cognition which is then being recognized, the recognitions, the recognitions, to recognize something, to recognize something, is a secondary act. It's a secondary layer, in the sense also of like a Kantian representation. There is a and that is always the problem in the novel, is because that a of the recognize is itself a mask, a veil, a mirror. It's, you know, a double bind. It's a folding. So you've never got the full appreciation of something. And the question throughout the entire novel really is, what is it within each character which, and what is it within these social structures which are bound, which means that we always have to have that secondary thing. And secondly, perhaps, what would it actually take to get rid of that thing? Can that double ever be erased? And whether or not there's an answer to that, I don't really. It's not something I can answer. But another interesting theme to insert, and alongside this discussion of authenticity, is the very honest and at times transparent admittance from Gaddis, once again leaning to the postmodern problem of the stereotypical reading of the failure of institutions and the failure of centrality to hold, but on the other hand, still abiding by the same grammar of that disappeared centrality to try and rediscover it again. And what Gaddis talks about here, in between the lines, is paternal absence, the absence specifically of a father figure, but not an individual father figure. Though in the case of Wyatt, most certainly the father is there, but he's absent. He's going mad. He has these other focuses. But also on a social level, in terms of many of the characters seeking to attend to something central, to something structured, and understanding that should be there, but not actually having the guidance needed to allow them to journey towards it in any structured sense, constantly becoming lost. And this leaves, the peculiarity is that the solidification of the absence of father figures has yet to really socially fully crystallize within society. And so you still have characters who are competent, who are intellectual, who are intuitive, who have vision, who have ambition, undoubtedly. And one of the interesting things is we're not left with often the often later gimmicky two-dimensional mask characters of postmodernism, which in themselves are meant to attune us to sort of a meta relation of the reader, of questioning what a character is altogether. These are most certainly extremely deep characters who have admirable traits, but they are left within a world unto which the underlying ambition itself is constantly thwarted. And you'd think that a novel of this depth and breadth and quite literal width would possibly collapse under its own weight. This detail, this encyclopedia, this theology, this sociology, this constant battle to not have the text fall into a empty existentialism, to talk on a social level as well. This never once even comes close to collapsing, but you could see how it could in the hands of a writer even with just a minor bit less skill than Gaddis, and it's a testament to Gaddis's ability that this whole thing doesn't just come crumbling down. But I think he perhaps understood that there needed to be, and though in such a case where this impotent battle towards authenticity within such an absent world is taking place, there can only be this paradox of striving towards that which we know is gone, but we don't actually know how to describe it, but we all know it's there, and we don't know how to approach it or what to do with it, but we will approach it anyway. This paradox of existing in this state has to be complete with pressure valves, with a build and a release, with a cyclic nature, which, if the reader wasn't given this, one might just go a bit mad, and you have to sort of witness people who've pushed it a bit too far within the novel to understand just exactly how heavy and burdensome seeing this problem for what it is, this march towards authenticity, unknowingly, possibly unconsciously, but even more dangerously knowingly, how burdensome this can be, and what might happen in this sense. So I'll relay one of the first breakdowns that's articulated in the novel, which not only is a testament to Gaddis's ability in terms of flow, in terms of rhythm especially, but also his ability to articulate that something's crumbling down, but it's not really crumbling down to anywhere. But this is page 376 to 377. There won't be any spoilers here. And so they named it Antimony, anathema to monks. Basil Valentine stood still in the near darkness, feeling every physical detail of his body, every one but his eyes, for the figure against the window was indistinct, its shape and size ambiguous, but for the eyes. Preach to them then, my Yetzirah, speak to them then, my evil heart, while I fly like a piece of cloth on the wind or the colour itself. The street is filling with people like buttons in Galilee. Speak to the Am Ha-Aretz, preach to them, pray. Tell them, as the composer predicted, there's nothing left but knowledge and evidence, and art's become a sort of tailbone, surviving in us from the good prehensile tail we held on with them. Tell them that Peter died an old man and right side up. Tell them that Mary broke her vows to go off with a soldier named Panthera and wandered away to give birth to his son. Tell them, the ones who are conscious of what happens to themselves only in terms of what has happened to themselves, who recognize only things that they have seen with their eyes. Tell them the whole thing hangs on a resurrection that only one lunatic saw, 1 and then 12 and then 500, for visions are contagious and resurrections were stock in trade. And the streets were full of messiahs spreading discontent that Jesus Christ and John the Baptist would both be arrested on the street today and jailed, and for the same reason. Tell them the truth, then, that Christ was thrown into a pit for common malefactors. Tell them the truth, then, not that power corrupts men, but men corrupt power. My Yetzirah, speak to them, preach to them, my evil heart, to the ones who look out the window and are not surprised to see the sun burning itself out 93 million miles away. The ones who dream of the dead and expect themselves to be dreamt of. The Am Ha-Aretz, filling the streets and seeking authority and no further. Write with a brass pencil on a clean tin plate. IAO, IAE. Corruption is no more than knowledge that comes too soon. Tell them of Athol's coronation with a red-hot iron crown, and of how the Egyptians burned red-haired men, scattered their ashes with winnowing fans. Tell them of Justinian's pavement made like an ocean and destroyed when the roof of St. Sophia fell in, and of the son of the ruler of Cairo, Ibn Tulun, sleeping on an inflated feather bed on a lake of quicksilver. Tell them of Antiope and the goat, of Pasiphae and the bull and the egg that laid a laid, to make them laugh if they'll listen. The Amha-arets, whose memories include nothing but their own failures. Tell them their suffering belittles them. Tell them that, my Yetzirah. Tell the ones who trade only in false coin, where they can buy clothes to wear when they are alone. That is all, and Gresham's law, and Gresham's law, and Gresham's law for love or money. Go out among them and tell them that their nostalgia for places that they have never been is sex, the sweating Amha-arets. And when they hear music, tell them it is their mother. Tell Nicodemus. Tell them there is no other way to be born again and again and again and again of 1,000 other mothers of others to be. Tell him, my Yetzirah, tell them, my evil heart, that they are hopeless. Tell them what damnation is and that they are damned, that what they have been forging all this time never existed. And these moments slice into the novel. Like Caesura's, these ruptures in the novel that have to happen. But outside of this, everything is so well held together. But we arrive in these moments. As the character Esme, who at a certain point, her breakdown culminates in her talking about herself in the third person, referencing herself as if she was a character in this great search for authenticity. The text is full to the brim with these references, these oddly specific, peculiar theological and spiritual references. Often they lead us nowhere, often they expand the text into something larger. The central character, so called, is lost for much of the novel. He only appears in 50% of the novel, in half of its chapters, and so there is no central character really. Central character is some search for authenticity, some impotent search for authenticity, which at times is acknowledged as being so. The central character, so called Wyatt, he loses his name for much of the novel and then is renamed as Stefan by the end. There's a pressure to don masks. Certain points characters are told by other characters quite literally what to say in certain social situations. It's masks upon masks upon masks, and at all times Gaddis as the author is demanding something extremely serious of the reader. He's demanding two things, in fact, I would say. He is demanding attention and he's demanding seriousness. He is an extremely funny, extremely cynical writer, and he's an amazing critic, and he's very witty, and he's very clever. But it isn't all for its own sake, as it is in some later postmodernist novels, I would have to admit. This is serious. The humour is serious. The acidic critique of much of the bohemian lifestyle which happens throughout the novel is serious. The reader has to pay attention, and in that sense, alongside its position between modernism and postmodernism, as an early progenitor of black humour, as an early example of Menippean satire, as a great example of biblical allegory woven into the modern day. Alongside all of this, the novel as itself inherently recognizes its possible cultural impotence at the time it arrives, because it's entering into a culture where seriousness and attention is dying out. Perhaps Gaddis knew, I would argue that he did from all the secondary I've now read, inclusive of Joseph Tabby's biography, Stephen Moore's work. Gaddis knew that it's not necessarily going to fall on deaf ears, but it's going to fall within a culture where no one's interested. No one really recognizes much anymore. No one wants to put in attention. Everything has become apathetic. apathetic in the sense of TV is an apathetic medium that you can just open your eyes and look at it and you take it in. Some books are the equivalent of this now. Many books now are simply purely function. Tell me a story about, some cheap science fiction novel or fantasy novel or genre fiction where, character goes here, does a thing, and then everything ends up happily ever after. As far as I'm concerned, that can be encapsulated in a couple of pages. We don't need a book to do that. But in that sense, much of what is known as literature today has also fallen into the problem of just being something to consume, not something to think about, not something to pry into, not something to poke, not something to be attentive about, not something to read time and time again and work out. And it's just demanding. It's beautiful. The flow is impeccable. The rhythm is incredible. The plot itself is epic. At times sad, at times tragic. And many times it's funny. Gaddis is an extremely funny writer, and I have moved on immediately on to reading J.R., which is even funnier. But it's a book of a lifetime, one of those books of a lifetime that before and after reading it, one can now safely say, there is my reading and understanding of literature before reading the recognitions and my reading, understanding and appreciation, or lack of appreciation, after reading the recognitions. That is how much of a rupture this book holds for myself personally, and I believe it holds in the history of literature from sort of 1800 onward. I would say it holds an extremely important place. It's, we often talk about writers such as Melville or Faulkner having their renaissance, their revival, sorry. I would even go as far to say that perhaps William Gaddis hasn't even had his first real look. One could argue against that and say that in his day, especially after the publication of J.R. and then especially after the publication of Carpenter's Gothic, that he was certainly known. But if we are to use a sort of very lazy metric on my half here, but it's the best way to do it, I think, is we use an infamous site such as Goodreads and look at the amount of reviews, something such as Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, 40,000 reviews. The recognitions is 5,000, so they're just statistically, in terms of consumer collective appreciation, I mean that half jokingly. Maybe we can say that Gaddis hasn't even really been appreciated at all yet. He holds such a peculiar place that it's difficult to realize the bridge that you're recognizing when you first read this book. But if you can, and you're into challenging literature, put aside some time at some point in your life. Put aside a month where this is going to be the book you keep going back to. Sometimes you can read 70 pages. Sometimes you can only read 5. It holds so much. And it's just deserving of the title masterpiece. It's deserving of an understanding wherein a book which pushes what literature can do when someone as intelligent and intuitive as Gaddis approaches literature. But that's the best I can do for a review of William Gaddis' The Recognitions. So thank you all very much.